Good morning, everybody. Great to be back with all of you, and I'm so thankful to my colleague Liz Wolfe, who filled in, and it's nice to see you again, Briahna.
It is good to have you back in the chair, Robby. I missed you. It's been too long. Just in time for our incredible show today, our rising panel will get into some of Biden's latest remarks on the economy, and we'll have a special guest break down what's going on with WNBA's Brittany Griner's Russian detention. Plus, we'll get into some new details on the Hunter Biden laptop saga.
But first, the Biden administration's best and brightest minds are admitting that the U.S. sanctions against Russia have exacerbated inflation, worsened global food security, and have punished ordinary citizens rather than Putin or his allies. Reports say White House officials originally believed sanctioning food and energy would have a minimal effect on inflation here at home.
According to Bloomberg, the U.S. government is quietly encouraging agricultural and shipping companies to buy and carry more Russian fertilizer in efforts to drive down food costs. And according to the report, certain industries can do business with Russia as long as they are not sanctioned entities. New reporting from the New York Times reveals that despite these sanctions, Russia saw huge profits from fossil fuels in the first 100 days of its war. And while the EU reduced its imports from Russia, India and the United Arab Emirates made up the losses.
Meanwhile, the U.S. is importing refined oil from the Netherlands and India, which most likely contains Russian crude, a loophole for oil to make its way from Russia to the U.S. anyway. So this is a pretty damning indictment of our entire approach. So based on this New York Times article, it was suggesting that, well, even if we're getting less, they're selling less oil, the price of it is so much higher because of the shortages caused by doing this embargo that they're making record profits anyway, and it's not really hurting. It's not hurting the Putin administration, which probably could have been foreseen. I don't think they have any economy. We raised it on the show, the issue that this wouldn't work.
There were so many people making this point, screaming it from the rooftops. It is a common sense, long-held left position that there's a skepticism about sanctions for exactly this reason. They tend to disproportionately hurt the people, the innocent people living in a country, and very infrequently have an effect on leadership. And we saw when the sanctions were first implemented, right? There was all this discussion of how we're going to target all of the oligarchs' yachts and keep their money from traveling all over the world. But we're talking about a part of the world where Ukraine was number four crypto country in the world, one of the most corrupt parts of the world. These oligarchs live all over the place. In London, they were having trouble locking out Russian oligarchs because they own so much of the real estate in the country. I mean, it was never going to be this kind of targeted approach that they said it was going to be. And it's really frustrating that when folks tried to raise that issue months ago, it was nothing but Putin's puppet, Putin's puppet, Putin's puppet.
Yeah, I mean, there's a you just spelled out the left opposition to sanctions, but there's a libertarian right opposition to sanctions as well, because we hurt a lot of people. We destroy commerce and exchange. The benefits from trading and engaging in that sort of thing that help everyone are put on hold for these nebulous government purposes that never seem to work. Where's the history of sanctions accomplishing the goals ever? Can we point to those examples? There are probably a few, but embargoing Cuba for 50 years or more didn't do a thing to the Castro regime. North Korea toiling in total economic blockade on its own, suffering miserable. The people there in horrible condition, but their regime as strong as ever, relatively speaking, within the country. Yeah. So it's just not. It just doesn't work. We have this kind of. We imagine, or our government imagines, I guess, that we can just bully other governments around by tinkering with the levers of the economy. We'll shut this off. We'll turn this down. We'll do this instead. All it does is blow up in our faces.
Yeah. And it also really calls us out as hypocrites on the world stage when we say we're going to sanction this country for this reason, and then have a very warm and Tony relationship with these other countries that are oftentimes acting similarly with respect to human rights abuses and other kind of bad actions going on internationally. This is the subject of my radar later in the show. But it is frustrating when you see exchanges like we talked about last week at the Conference in the Americas, where Abby Martin asked Antony Blinken a direct question about why is it that certain countries are being excluded from the conference on the basis of their human rights record, while others are being accepted even though they've murdered American journalists? Why are we going to certain parts of the world and begging for oil, as Joe Biden plans to do next month, that have a long rap sheet of human rights violations, and doing it basically under the pretense of wanting to hurt Russia because of its international law violations and doing it imperialism? The inconsistency really makes it difficult to understand America as the protector of freedom.
Right. It's inconsistency from week to week, from month to month, certainly from administration to administration, but even on a more confined level. I don't. What is the administration trying to do? What is Biden thinking? Are they just trying to lose? Like, Democrats are just going to lose. Like, the fate of the Democratic Party now rests on bringing inflation and the bad economic situation under control to some degree. And they're just not even trying.
They're not even trying.
They're not even trying. It makes no sense. It's like trying to lose. If you do nothing, you'll lose. So this comes as the Ukrainian president, Zelensky, has continued to urge top U.S. business leaders and mayors to cease operations with Russia. Just yesterday, Zelensky pleaded for more weaponry, saying Ukraine's fight to defend the Donbas against Russia will go down in military history as one of the most brutal battles in Europe and for Europe.
But as Western military leaders are prepared to meet in Brussels today and tomorrow, officials are hesitant. The New York Times reports that American officials are doing a delicate dance of trying to push Ukraine to settle negotiations while being careful to not overstep.
Well, which is the right approach. We don't want to dictate to them what they should do, but we should be like, hey, what you should do is come to some kind of peace agreement, and this has to end because it's impoverishing, it's causing people to starve. We didn't sign up for this. We don't want the American people do not want this. They do not want a perpetual proxy war with Russia.
We, being Joe Biden, very much did sign up for this. Part of the whole first month of this conflict was getting people to recognize, the Western roots of some of this back in 2014. But now that we're here, look, the problem here is that this was all deeply predictable. We're talking about America sending weapons to basically extend a conflict with a nuclear power. The nuclear power part of it was always the end game. What are you going to do to actually empower Ukraine to win this war? Nothing. It's impossible. So it became a proxy war between two nuclear powers, and we all know how that kind of thing ends. There's been 50 years of movies about this kind of a thing. And so we were always going to end up here. We were always going to end up in a place where it was about negotiations and compromise. And the question was, how many people were going to die? How many weapons were going to be sent to this part of the world? How much money was going to be spent? How much were Americans going to have to pay the price at the pump before that happened? Joe Biden knew that. And when he announced in his speech that we were going to sanction Russia and that we were going to give military aid, he said explicitly, the American people have signed up for this, that Democrats and Republicans alike believe that this is a righteous cause. Well,
that's not right. But that's not true. They're saying that on behalf of the people. The people never said that. Obviously, Russia is the bad guy. The Putin regime is evil. If it collapsed, fine. But we can't. That can't be the aim of the conflict, because then the conflict will go on forever. And then, also what happens if the regime does collapse, right? How many times has it collapsed and been replaced by something better? Right.
It's not our job to do regime change.
No. How many times do you have to learn that?
With nuclear powers or anyone, frankly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But they caused this. They started it. They should not have done that, and we had to respond in some way. But there has to be some consent. If there was vast, what I'm saying is, if there was vast consent and agreement among the American people that we want some kind of protracted struggle on behalf of Ukraine, I would probably disagree with that, but I would say, okay. But that's clearly not what the people want. The people are clearly sending a message that they do not want this conflict to go on. It's too ruinous and destructive domestically. We can't afford it. We don't want to pay it. We're not prepared for it. We wanted to get out of this kind of thing, and yet here we are again.
Yeah, we used to have to go to Congress to go to war.
Right.
And now you just do a proxy battle, and it's all good.
Yeah, that's what I mean. There's no consent to do it.
Yeah.
There's no, technically there is, because Congress said, sure.
Yeah.
But that's not what the people want. And Republicans are actually realizing that, now not across the party, not the majority of the party, but the sliver of opposition in government to doing this is all coming from Republicans, which is fascinating.
I think that's right. I interviewed a couple of the most left people in Congress on my show in the course of this. I spoke to Bernie Sanders' foreign policy person, Matt Duss, and he was more hawkish perhaps isn't the right word, but more hawkish than I think most of the left expected. I spoke to Ro Khanna back about a month or 6 weeks ago, and again more recently, and those positions still haven't changed. And that's kind of what the best and the brightest the left has to offer in Congress right now. And so I have to concede that point. There isn't a lot of anti-war sentiment coming from the left. Yeah. It's a weird place to be in.
I thought they'd be able to see through it, honestly. The sort of DC, what the blob, we call it, right? The military-industrial complex in the government, the defense contracting, all of that seems to, even though we all know this doesn't, we have so many examples of this kind of thing not working, that sort of, the blob assimilates, the Congress into voting for more war, voting for more weapons, that kind of thing. It takes a real clear-eyed philosophical opposition to see through that. And I know many on the hard left, despite my numerous disagreements with them on lots of policies, on foreign policy are often able to see through it. So it's interesting that it's not quite so this time.
Yeah.
Well, I look forward to hearing what's on your radar coming up next.